I still cannot explain why that house was so cheap. Even now people ask me the same question and I never know what to tell them, because if I told them the truth they probably would not believe me. My wife and I had been looking for a home for almost 8 months. Every place we liked was either too expensive or needed major repairs. We were honestly starting to lose hope. Then one morning our realtor called and said a new listing had just appeared. The price immediately caught my attention. Because it was almost 40% lower than every other house in the neighborhood, I thought it had to be a mistake. When we arrived everything looked perfect. The house was beautiful. It had a large backyard, hardwood floors, a stone fireplace, a finished basement and even a small workshop behind the garage. Nothing looked abandoned or damaged. The inspection report showed no major problems. The roof had recently been replaced. The plumbing worked perfectly. The electrical system had been updated only a few years earlier. Nothing explained why such a house would sell for so little. I asked the realtor several times if something had happened there, maybe a fire, maybe a flood, maybe a crime. Every time he smiled politely and gave exactly the same answer. The previous owner passed away, his children live in different states and they want a quick sale. His answers sounded reasonable, but something about the way he said it made me uncomfortable. My wife noticed it too. She whispered that he looked nervous every time we mentioned the history of the house. Still, we decided to buy it because opportunities like that almost never happen. Looking back, that decision changed our lives forever. The first 2 weeks were completely normal. We unpacked our furniture, painted the walls, replaced a few cabinets and laughed about how lucky we had been. Every evening we sat on the back porch imagining all the memories we would create there. Then one afternoon I was measuring the basement because I wanted to build storage shelves along one wall. I measured it once, then twice, then a third time because the numbers simply refused to make sense. According to the outside dimensions of the house, the basement should have been almost 4 feet wider. At first I blamed my tape measure. The next day I borrowed another one from my neighbor. The result was exactly the same. That missing space had to be somewhere. Curiosity got the better of me. That night I searched the county records and downloaded the original blueprints of the house. I expected them to prove that I had simply made a mistake. Instead, they created an even bigger mystery. The basement shown on the plans looked completely different. There was a narrow hallway that no longer existed. There was also a small room behind the workshop wall. According to the blueprints, that room should still have been there, but in reality there was only a long solid wall. I checked every renovation permit connected to the property and found nothing. No official records mentioned changing the basement layout. Someone had rebuilt part of the house without leaving a single document behind. The next evening I carried a flashlight downstairs and started comparing every wall with the old plans. After almost an hour I stopped in front of a row of heavy wooden shelves that had probably not been moved in years. I pulled everything off them and dragged them away from the wall. Then I knocked on the concrete. At first it sounded completely solid. I moved a little farther to the right and knocked again. This time I heard a deep hollow echo. I froze for a moment, then knocked a third time. The sound was exactly the same. There was definitely empty space behind that wall. I grabbed a small drill and carefully made a tiny hole just above the floor. When I shined my flashlight through it, the beam disappeared into darkness. It did not hit another wall. It did not reflect back. There was a hidden space behind the concrete. My heart started beating faster. I made the opening slightly larger and felt a rush of cold, stale air coming from inside. The smell reminded me of old paper, damp wood, and a room that had not been opened for decades. I called my wife downstairs without telling her what I had found. She looked through the hole and immediately stepped back. Neither of us said a word for several seconds. Then she quietly asked the same question. That was already running through my mind. If this room was always here, why did someone go through so much effort to hide it? The next morning I bought a small inspection camera instead of breaking the wall immediately. I wanted to know what was waiting on the other side before making a mess. After carefully making the hole a little larger, I pushed the camera inside. At first all I could see was dust floating through the beam of light. Then the picture slowly became clear. There was a narrow hallway, wooden shelves, an old chair lying on its side and another door at the very end. Nobody had stepped inside for many years. The floor was completely covered with dust and not a single footprint could be seen. We looked at each other and knew there was only one thing left to do. Later that afternoon I carefully removed enough concrete blocks to squeeze through the opening. The air inside felt colder than the rest of the basement and every sound echoed through the narrow passage. It honestly felt like walking into another world. When we reached the second door I expected it to be locked, but the handle slowly turned. The hinges groaned so loudly that both of us jumped. Inside was a room much larger than either of us expected. There was an old wooden desk, several bookshelves filled with notebooks, dusty boxes stacked against the walls, a broken lamp, framed family photographs, and a large metal safe sitting quietly in the corner. Strangely, nothing looked as if someone had searched through it. Everything seemed frozen in time. I walked to the desk first because the safe was obviously locked. Inside the top drawer I found dozens of journals. Each one had a different year written on the cover. The earliest notebook started almost 30 years before the previous owner died. I opened the first page and immediately realized these were not ordinary diaries. Every page contained measurements, sketches of the house, strange symbols, and handwritten notes. Some words were crossed out again and again as if the owner had changed his mind hundreds of times. One sentence appeared over and over throughout the notebooks: "The truth is still inside these walls." At first I thought he was talking about hidden money, but the more I read, the less certain I became. There were pages covered with calculations, maps of the basement, drawings of fireplaces, windows, and even individual bricks. This man had spent years searching every inch of his own house. Then I found an old photograph tucked between two pages. It showed the living room exactly as it had looked decades earlier. Something immediately caught my attention. Behind the fireplace there was a large grandfather clock. When I looked around our own living room, that clock was gone. In its place stood an ordinary bookshelf that had probably been installed years later. I turned the photograph over and found a short handwritten note: "Never trust what was added later." I showed it to my wife and neither of us spoke for a moment. Suddenly this no longer felt like a simple hidden room. It felt like someone had left behind a puzzle that had never been solved. Before leaving that night I picked up the final journal from the desk. Unlike the others, it contained only a few pages. The last entry was written just 3 weeks before the owner died. It said, "I know I am close. Someone changed the house after my father disappeared. They wanted everyone to believe the treasure never existed, but they forgot one thing: houses remember everything. If you are reading this, then I failed. Please finish what I started." I closed the notebook and looked around the room again. For the first time I stopped thinking about treasure. I started wondering who would spend 30 years chasing something that might not even exist, and more importantly, who had worked so hard to make sure nobody else would ever find it. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes I kept thinking about the journals and that final sentence. The next morning I called the county office hoping to learn more about the previous owner. The woman on the phone told me the house had belonged to the same family for almost 70 years and very few records existed before that. She also mentioned something interesting. Nearly 30 years earlier the owner had applied for a renovation permit but cancelled it only a few days later. No explanation was ever given. That detail matched the date of the first journal. It was the moment his search had truly begun. After hanging up I went straight back to the hidden room and started reading every notebook from the beginning instead of jumping from page to page. This time I noticed something I had completely missed before. Certain words were underlined in red ink while others were circled in blue. At first they looked random, but after writing them down in order they formed a single sentence. "The first key is hidden where the morning light reaches the last stone." I immediately thought about the fireplace because the living room faced east. The next morning I woke up before sunrise and sat quietly with a cup of coffee waiting for the first rays of sunlight to enter the room. As the sun slowly climbed higher, a narrow beam crossed the wooden floor and stopped on the lower corner of the stone fireplace. I carefully examined every stone, but nothing seemed unusual. After almost an hour I was ready to give up when my wife noticed one stone was slightly smoother than the others. It had almost no dust on it, even though the fireplace had clearly not been moved in years. I pressed against it but nothing happened. Then I noticed a tiny hole barely large enough for the tip of a pencil. I remembered the old keys hanging inside the hidden room. There had been dozens of them with faded labels. I ran downstairs and searched through every drawer until I found the smallest key. It fit perfectly. I turned it slowly and heard a quiet click. A section of stone slid backward only a few inches, revealing a narrow compartment. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. Inside there was no gold, no cash, and no jewelry. There was only a small wooden box containing another photograph, an old compass, and a folded letter. For a second I felt disappointed until I unfolded the paper. The letter was written by the owner's father. It explained that anyone could find money if they searched long enough, but only someone patient enough to solve every clue deserved to discover the family's true secret. At the bottom of the page there was one final line that immediately sent a chill down my spine. "This is only the first hiding place. If you have reached this point, then you are closer than anyone has ever been. But the second key is no longer inside this house." The moment I finished reading that letter, I felt both excited and frustrated. After everything we had discovered, the answer was still out of reach. I searched the wooden box again, hoping I had missed something. Besides the compass and the photograph, there was only a small brass token with the number 27 engraved on one side and a tiny maple leaf on the other. It looked ordinary, but I knew it had to mean something. I went back through every journal looking for the same symbol. After nearly 2 hours, I finally found it. Next to one of the old sketches the previous owner had written only 4 words, Maple Hill Train Station. My wife immediately searched the name online and discovered the station had been abandoned almost 20 years earlier. It was only a 30-minute drive from our house. Early the next morning we packed a flashlight, the journals, and the old compass before heading there. The station was almost completely overgrown with weeds. Broken windows covered the front building and the old tracks had turned orange with rust. According to the journals, the owner's father used to work there before the war. We walked through every room without finding anything until I noticed the compass needle behaving strangely. Instead of pointing north, it slowly turned toward one corner of the old waiting room. Beneath years of dirt stood a row of rusted metal lockers. Most of the doors had already fallen off, but one remained locked, painted. Across it was the faded number 27. I could hardly believe it. The brass token fit perfectly into a small slot beneath the handle. With a loud click, the door opened. Inside there was another weathered wooden box wrapped in cloth. My hands were shaking as I lifted the lid. This time we found several old documents, a leather notebook, and a sealed envelope with the words, "For whoever never gave up," written across the front. I carefully opened it and began reading. The letter explained that the family treasure had never been hidden for its financial value alone. It represented proof that the family's land had been stolen after the war, and the documents inside the box were the only surviving records that could prove the truth. The grandfather had hidden everything in separate locations because he feared that if one hiding place was discovered, the entire history of his family would disappear forever. At the very end of the letter there was one final clue. I smiled the moment I read it because I already knew exactly where it was leading us. The final hiding place had been under our feet from the very beginning. Not behind a wall, not inside the fireplace, and not inside the hidden room, but beneath the oldest oak tree in the backyard of the house we now called home. We drove home faster than we probably should have. Neither of us said much during the trip because we were both thinking the same thing. The answer had been sitting in our own backyard the entire time. As soon as we arrived, I grabbed a shovel and walked toward the old oak tree. According to the property records, it had been planted more than 60 years earlier. The journals mentioned it several times, but I had always assumed the owner simply liked sitting beneath its branches. Now I realized every reference had been another clue. We measured the distance from the trunk exactly as described in the final letter. Then I pushed the shovel into the ground. After only a few minutes I struck something solid. It was not a rock. It sounded like metal. We dug more carefully until the top of a small steel chest appeared beneath the roots. It was badly rusted but completely intact. My hands were shaking as I lifted it out of the ground and placed it on the grass. The lock had almost completely rusted away, so it opened with very little effort. Inside were several velvet pouches filled with old gold coins, a pocket watch, a wedding ring, military medals, and dozens of handwritten family letters tied together with faded ribbon. Beneath everything else lay a thick folder containing property deeds, birth certificates, and official documents dating back many decades. Everything the letter had promised was there. Suddenly I understood why the previous owner had spent 30 years searching for it. This was never about becoming rich, it was about recovering the history his family had lost. A few days later we contacted his granddaughter and asked if she would be willing to visit. When she stepped into the hidden room and saw the journals, she immediately started crying. She told us her grandfather had devoted almost every weekend of his life to solving the mystery but died believing he had failed. When I placed the steel chest on the table, she covered her mouth with both hands and could not speak for several minutes. Together we opened every pouch and every letter. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Many of the names inside the documents belonged to relatives she had only heard about as a child. Before leaving, she handed me another envelope that had been kept with her grandfather's personal papers. Inside was a copy of his will. One paragraph stood out immediately. It said that if anyone ever completed the search and returned the family's belongings, that person should receive the savings account he had set aside over many years as a gesture of gratitude. A month later, the family insisted on honoring his final wish. The money was generous, but it was never the part of the story I remembered most. What stayed with me was the look on her face when she realized her grandfather had been right all along. People still ask me how I managed to buy such a beautiful house for such a low price. I usually smile and tell them we were simply lucky. The truth is, we did not just buy an old house. We inherited someone's unfinished journey, and after decades of waiting, we were finally able to give that story the ending it deserved.